And so the first thing is I tell people, when you invest in fair chance hiring, that doesn't mean hire every single person with a record. We believe that every single company has a right to and should hire the best person for the job. We don't want them to lower the bar. Like I said, we just want them to lower the barrier to access. And so first, we want to make sure that you're getting the right talent in your pipeline. So working with community-based organizations in your area who do workforce development training for this population is the first step. You don't want to just take anybody in off the streets. You want someone who's went through soft skills. You want somebody who's went through digital literacy training. You want people who are prepared and can compete with everybody else. You don't want to have to like handhold people. You're looking for talent, right? And that's part of the job of the HR professional.
Ken Oliver is the Vice President of Checkr.org, the social impact division of the background screening company Checkr, Inc. He also serves as the Executive Director of the Checkr Foundation. Checkr.org is dedicated to the mission of building a fairer future of work, one job at a time, by reshaping the narrative and providing pathways to sustainable employment for the 80 million Americans with an arrest and conviction record. Ken's professional expertise spans the landscape of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, record clearance, talent development, talent sourcing strategy, change management, and public policy. His insights and contributions to the field have been recognized and featured in publications such as Newsweek, Forbes, Fast Company, Inc., and the New York Times, as well as others. He also played a role in shaping California Governor Gavin Newsom's 2021 Future of Work report. Ken, welcome to Voices of HR.
Thank you for having me, Bert. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it is such a pleasure to have you. And I told you this before we got on the recording that I woke up this morning and I thought to myself, I get to interview Ken Oliver. I am so excited about this.
Thank you very much.
So sometimes life puts us on a path that we didn't quite expect. And you have an incredible story to tell. Can you tell our listeners about it?
Sure. So my path to becoming a vice president and an executive director did not take the traditional course. And it's a course that I don't recommend to your average person. I got to this position by actually serving 24 years in a California prison under California's 3 strikes law, where I was given life in prison for being a passenger in a stolen vehicle. While in prison, I served almost 9.5 years in solitary confinement for reading a book. And so this confluence of events that happened to me in my 20s ended up with me filing a lawsuit against the state of California for my incarceration and for my solitary confinement. And subsequently, with the help of Stanford University and a corporate law firm by the name of Bear Brown, I was successful in securing my release in 2019. And so when I got released from prison in 2019, I was picked up as a paralegal by a public interest law firm. Very fortunate to Legal Services for Prisons with Children for that opportunity. And then about 2 months into doing that work and diving in head first, my executive director came in and he said, Ken, we knew that you could write legal briefs because you wrote your way out of prison, but we didn't realize that you could talk. So he said, we're going to make you the state policy director and have you go do some lobbying for criminal justice reform in California with legislators in Sacramento and working with the governor's office. And so that was a tremendous opportunity for me to be on the forefront of policy change in California. And so one of the things that I had the opportunity to talk to a lot of companies, especially here in Silicon Valley, about was ban the box, or what's also known as the Fair Chance Act. And it had just passed in 2018. So a lot of companies and HR departments weren't aware of the laws around ban the box policy. And ban the box, or also known as fair chance, is this notion that companies should not be able to inquire about a particular person's arrest or conviction history until they make a conditional offer of employment. Now, someone may ask, well, why is that? Part of the reason that government has kind of stepped in and created these policies in 37 states across the country is because we as a society have kind of subjected folks to this scarlet letter once they've been arrested or convicted in this country. And so what public policymakers are trying to do is say, listen, corporate America, we want you to hire the best person for the job. and offer the person that's the best person for the job. And then once you've done that, then take a look at the circumstances behind their particular background, whether that be for an arrest conviction, a tax lien, et cetera, and so forth. The idea was to limit some of the bias that occurs in the process. And so I did that for about a year and had a lot of success talking to companies about that, and spoke to a lot of companies about how to take that to the next level. How do we create paid internship opportunities? How do we create apprenticeship programs and other programs where we could pathway men and women who have typically been excluded from the livable wage job market into careers versus just jobs? And how could we give people a sense of dignity in that path, and also provide them some form of economic mobility? And the reason why that's important and why that work is important is because the number one driver of incarceration or recidivism in this country is poverty. Mm-hmm. And so when people don't have clear pathways to the middle class economy, then all of these kind of symptoms grow out of that life circumstance for any type of people. And it's across races. And so I did that for about a year, and then had the opportunity in 2020 to become the executive director of an upstart nonprofit that was workforce development related. And I set out as executive director, and I said at the time I was going to create the Stanford of reentry programs. What I wanted to do was create this high-end training education mechanism for men and women who had interactions with the Justice Department, to provide them the skills necessary to compete with kids that are coming out of Stanford, UC Berkeley, Harvard, MIT, et cetera. And the only way that you could compete is if you have the skills necessary and the education necessary to have employers take you in. Because my motto was, we don't want employers to lower the bar to their talent. We want them to lower the barrier and the access, right? And so, after talking to the governor's office and over 100 of conversations with legislators in California, they elected to write me in the budget for $30 million to build the first ever residentially based tech training program in the country. It was a very proud moment, not from an ego standpoint, but the fact that the governor and the legislature bought into the idea that people who were closest to social problems are the ones that should be providing the solutions and leading those movements. And that's across sector, not just for justice impacted people. And it's really a notion that's kind of counterintuitive to government, because we're used to government coming in and solving society's problems. But
right.
The government in this case said, hey, the people who are boots on the ground, who are living through some of these social challenges that we experience as a society, they probably have the best insight to what's going on. And they probably have some solutions that we haven't thought about because we haven't experienced those things. So I'm really proud to be a Californian, and the fact that the California government and legislature believed in me and innovation and thinking about how to solve problems in new ways. So shortly on the heels of that, by this time I'd only been home 2 years, so a lot had already kind of transpired. I went through 3 jobs. Checkr, who is this amazing startup company in Silicon Valley here, had been doing fair chance hiring since 2015. And they had done it to not a whole lot of fanfare. They weren't looking for publicity. They weren't looking to get written up in the paper. They had kind of done it because Checkr is a background check company.
Yes.
And the founders of the company, Daniel Yannis and Jonathan Parashon, saw firsthand some of the disparate impact that happened as a result of background checks. 95% of companies run background checks in America. And so they saw like, hey, wait a minute, there's this large swath of people that are constantly getting rejected for jobs. A lot of these people are Black and brown people. What can we do to change the narrative? And to their credit, they just started hiring people. And they started hiring people because they wanted to show their customers, and they have some of the biggest businesses in the world as customers, that you could demystify some of the narratives that we have been telling ourselves about what it means to hire somebody with a record. And so in 2015, they hired their first person that had just served life in prison as an engineer. That person is still at the company today and has done wonderful, promoted 5 or 6 times in the company. And since then, they kind of just kept doing it. And today, out of 1,500 employees, 5% of our workforce is justice impacted folks in every different business sector, marketing, HR, legal, talent acquisition, customer success, sales. We have people in every aspect of the business, and they regularly outperform regular employees because of the opportunities they've been given. And we can talk about that a little bit later. And so to Checkr's credit, they wanted somebody with proximate leadership to come in and evangelize this message across the country. They wanted somebody with proximate leadership to lead their corporate social responsibility business unit. And they wanted somebody with proximate leadership to form a corporate foundation that was based on these principles of using background checks as tools for inclusion rather than tools of exclusion. And so my hat goes off to Daniel and Jonathan for having that very innovative and forward-thinking vision and bringing me in to do this wonderful work, which I get to affect people's lives on a daily basis.
You do. And we always talk about courage in leadership. And I would say that was a courageous move back then, right?
Absolutely.
And now they have you to go out there and evangelize and share the insight, right? And educate and inform other C-suites about fair chance hiring, which is such a gift to all of us. So talk to us a little bit about when you walk into these C-suites and you need to convince them. I suspect that they have some preconceived notions about what this is all about and what the risks are, right, to their brand, to their organization. When we talked earlier, you had some incredible proof points on your side. Can you tell our audience a little bit about those?
Sure. Well, a lot of what I get a chance to do is to talk to executives across the country and in the C-suite most often, and talk about DE&I and inclusive hiring practices and talk about what that means. And oftentimes I'm contacted by these companies because they've heard me do some form of thought leadership at a conference or a panel or a webinar like this, a podcast, or read an article that I've written in an op-ed. And they're always really, really curious about this idea because most executives don't realize that 1/3 of the American workforce has an arrest or conviction history, which means that
1/3.
1/3. So if you work in a company of 1,000, the numbers statistically say that 300 of those people will have been arrested in their lifetime or have some type of conviction record, whether it be for a misdemeanor or whatever else. And first, they don't know that. And then when I share with them some of the stories of people who have been successful, and we'll talk about some of those stories a little bit later, I suspect, they're really amazed at how those stories are able to unwind their previous notions that they've had about what it means to have a record in this country. Because, after all, most of our opinion is shaped by the things that we see in the media or the stories that we've been told. And so when you think about John Walsh in America's Most Wanted, you think about cops, you think about the inundation of Dateline style programs that are, always constantly showing the worst of what's happening in society. We start to form these narratives about what that means. And the reality is that there are bad people who do bad things. And some of those people should probably never be fully integrated back into society. But 95% of the people who have a touch point with the justice system are coming home. The reason that they're coming home is because we all as taxpayers have invested in a system of justice that says a person does X, they go pay a cost for that, which is Y. And then when the cost is paid, they come back to the community. What's off, and we've all invested in that. We pay our tax dollars every year in the counties and states that we live in to say that that's the way the system should work. What we don't often talk about is what happens afterwards, right? And so when I appeal to business executives, I talk about that piece of it, but then I also talk about how it's harmed their business. Over $100 billion a year is taken out of the GDP every year for people who are taken out of the workforce because they have a record. So it's a lot of money. I also talk about the cost of attrition and what happens when you hire somebody who's been excluded from the market versus someone who is very, for lack of a better term, entitled in the market. Like in the tech sector where I work, I think the average stay is 2.5 years before people move on to other companies. And when you look at, well, why does that matter? Well, the justice impact of people we have, they stay there forever. We've never had one person leave voluntarily. We've had one person leave in the last 8 years, and that's because they got promoted to a higher position at another company. And so when you think about the loyalty and the dedication, because people are so grateful for being given an opportunity. I mean, you're talking about people who have never worked more than for $20 an hour in their life. And all of a sudden they're making $150,000 a year as a software engineer. They're making $120,000 a year as a marketing person on a marketing team. It's life-changing.
Yeah.
Not only is it life-changing for them, Berta, but it's also life-changing for their children and their families. It's generational change that happens because now they can be a positive example for their children. They can be a positive example for their families. And it just has this ripple effect that enhances the community and makes the community safer, right? Mm-hmm. So those are a few of the arguments that I use. And then obviously a lot of C-suite folks talk about how much they'd love to do it. And they start talking about risk management and negligent hiring and some of those types of conversations. And then that's when I go into data scientist mode. And I start talking about the data.
Do tell. You have so much data to share.
Yeah. So there's a long history of cases in America that talk about negligent hiring and the suits that have been filed. And that's not to say that there's never been a negligent hiring suit as a result of somebody without a record. There has been. But there's so far and few in between. I think it's been like 5 a year for the last 50 years total. And most of those have had nothing to do with whether somebody had a record or not. It had to do with whether a person was skilled up to do a particular job and they got hired and made some type of critical error on the job. We also have a lot of data that we share with CEOs about the production and the promotion value of justice impacted folks. At Checkr, of the folks that we've hired, justice impacted people promote 60% faster and more often than regular employees. Now, when you think about that, that's interesting because you have employees at these tech companies that come from some of the finest universities in the country. Some of the most brilliant minds work, in Silicon Valley here, which has, been demonstrated by what the tech industry has been able to do the last 30 years. And yet, when you take someone who typically has been counted out, somebody who we typically would think wouldn't have intellectual capacity to have a value proposition, they're actually outperforming in many cases. The data shows this. Some of the best and smartest and brightest. And so it's really a nod to what's possible. I call it the power of possibility. When you give people the opportunity, you desegregate that opportunity and you give people the opportunity to perform and to compete. Wonderful things happen.
Absolutely. And you actually have, and I want to talk about this up front because you have a story of Larry Miller that I would love for you to tell our audience now, because it is amazing and it puts so many exclamation points behind what you're saying.
Sure. So, one of the things that I get a chance to do in addition to talking to C-suite, I get a chance to talk to some of the most amazing people who've been justice impacted in this country, people at Microsoft, people at other tech companies and big manufacturing places, people at JP Chase. But perhaps one of the greatest stories that I love to talk about, and like I said, I could talk about dozens more, is the story of my friend Larry Miller at Nike. And Larry's such an interesting story for so many reasons, unsuspecting reasons. He did 10 years in prison. He grew up in West Philadelphia. And while he was in prison, he got his AA degree and then went to Temple University through a college program that existed at the time in the prison system. And he graduated at the top of his class in accounting. Now, when you think about that, here's a guy in a prison cell who's working the numbers and becomes a genius at accounting of all things, right? And so on the day of graduation, the recruiters come into, the Temple campus and they're recruiting the best in the class. And the final hiring manager, he's went through like 4 interviews during the day, tells Larry that they think they're going to offer him a job. And Larry tells himself, like, I'd love to be able to share my story with this hiring manager. And this is pre-Google, right? When Larry's having this conversation. And they weren't doing a lot of background checks back then. And so Larry decides to be transparent, which is really a nod to Larry. Like here's a person that we think would probably be dishonest or he's in prison or this and that. He wants to be forthright and transparent. And he shares his story with the gentleman. And the gentleman pulls out the offer letter and tells him, because of what you told me, I'm not going to offer you the job, and gets up and walks away. And so Larry is dejected. And he says to himself, which should be the happiest moment of his life, graduating, from Temple University. He says, I don't think I'm going to be transparent and share that anymore voluntarily. Meaning if someone asks, I'll be honest about it, but I don't think I'm just going to volunteer that information because that didn't go too well. And so he ends up going to have a storied career at Campbell's and Kraft and other companies. And he ends up landing at Nike. And all during his career trajectory, no one knows that he's been incarcerated. He's performing based on merit, based on his value proposition. And he's constantly rising. He ends up taking over Nike domestic apparel before there were Nike stores and all of this fanfare around Nike clothing. And he's so successful that Phil Knight, one of the most storied founders in world history, like the Nike brand may be the most famous brand of all time, currently, comes to him and asks him, does he want to run the Michael Jordan brand? Michael Jordan had just retired. So the executives at Nike thought that Michael Jordan's value proposition as a brand had kind of went away with his retirement. And so when they came to Larry thought outside of that box. This is one of the reasons I respect Larry so much is Larry understood what Michael Jordan, the symbol, meant to the world, meant to the Black community. And he created a campaign around making the Jordan symbol a symbol of greatness rather than just a symbol of basketball. So he brought in other athletes, he brought in entertainers, Stevie Wonder, Mary J. Blige, others, and created this whole campaign around this notion. And in 5 years, he took the Jordan brand from 140 million in domestic sales to like $5 billion in sales in that period of time. He was so successful that an opportunity came to him to be the president of the Portland Trail Blazers. And for those of you in the audience who may not know who owns that, that's Paul Allen, the co-founder of Microsoft, who saw something in Larry's value proposition and what he had done at Nike and wanted some of that special sauce over there at his NBA team.
Absolutely.
So he did that. It was very successful there. And then several years later, after a pretty long stint with the Portland Trail Blazers, he went back to Nike where he's at today. And it's funny because this entire tenure, no one knows that Larry did this time in prison and had this record. Like he had a record for homicide as a child when he was young. And so his daughter, who's this amazing woman, says to him, your story is so fascinating and so compelling that you should share this with America. You should share it with high school kids and college kids and talk about how to take tragedy and turn that into triumph. Talk about resilience and what tenacity you have and what's possible when you put your mind to something. And so he tells his daughter, like, listen, I'm going to make a couple phone calls. You keep pestering me about this. And if these people give the green light for it, I'll go ahead and do it. And so to make a long story short, he ends up calling Michael Jordan and Phil Knight and has conversations with both of those gentlemen about his past, something he had never done before. And he told me, Ken, when I was talking to Michael Jordan, after I finished telling the story, the phone was dead silent for 30 seconds. And Michael said something to the effect like, Larry, if you don't tell that story, I'll never talk to you again, and gives him the green light.
That's
and
awesome.
Then, he hangs up and goes to tell the story to Phil Knight. And Phil Knight says, Larry, that wasn't something I expected you to say, but I'm very proud of you. And I think it's a story worth telling. And so in 2022, he wrote a book called From the Streets to the Boardroom. And he was featured on Sports Illustrated and 60 Minutes, et cetera. And it talks about his rise, from that environment to the success that he had. And I share with people, like, the lesson here is not the fact that Larry Miller was successful at running the Jordan brand. It's not that he was successful running the Portland Trail Blazers. What the story here is this is the reason why every C-suite and every boardroom in America needs to understand what diversity and inclusion brings, what value that brings, because it's not about race. I say Larry Miller wasn't successful because he's Black, and make no mistake about it, he's Black, right? Larry Miller was successful because of his perspective and his lived experience and the way that he was able to apply his perspective and lived experience to a product, to a marketing campaign, to a culture at a company. These are all things that we as business people value on a daily basis. And the fact that he was able to take a product that was, I don't want to say it was struggling, but it was doing 140 million. And he made the value of that product, 20x in 4 short periods of time. That's something every business owner would salivate to have in a executive is somebody who could do that, right? And so when we think about how we source talent as HR executives and C-suite folks, we need to think about the fabric of America and what that looks like. And the more voices, the more people that have different types of lived experience, right? The more valuable the ideas that come out of that pot, the more talent that's going to come out of that pot, the more different strategies are going to come out of that pot. And ultimately, that's going to add a big P&L plus to our business on a regular basis. And the data shows that the more diverse teams, more teams that are inclusive. McKinsey's done studies, Forbes, you name it. The studies are out there that show the more diverse your team, the more money you're going to make and the more valuable your business is going to be.
Mm-hmm. And there's so many things that you just said that I have to play back for our audience.
Sure.
So stick with me on this. So DE&I, we don't expect you to lower the bar. We expect you to lower the barrier.
That's right.
That is incredible. That's a quote card right there. And I agree with you on the perspective that the most hungry individuals, the ones when I work with C-suites to identify their next gen talent, it's the ones who are hungry.
That's right.
It's the ones where the deck is stacked against them, the ones that maybe they don't have all the skills yet, but they want to succeed. Those are the ones who you want to invest in.
That's right.
And that's exactly what you're saying here. Don't lower the bar, lower the barrier.
That's right. It's a recipe for success.
It does. It does. Because I think you had quoted this before, that there are 80 million individuals with records and that there's 10 million job openings today and only 5 million to fill them.
I think it's about 5.7 was the latest labor report. So I'm glad that you brought this up about the labor shortage, because it's one of the important points that we talk about with executives across the country. And that is because the birth rate has declined in America. Baby boomers are retiring. Millennials and Gen Z are having less children, right? And so I think right now we're at about a 1.7 child per couple now, where it used to be 2.4. And that number is continuously dropping because of the cost of living and everything else. There's a variety of factors that go into that. And so what's happened is we're trying to grow as an economy, right? And this is from the macro and also extends down to the micro. And we don't have enough people to fill the jobs to fulfill the growth of the economy over time. And so if every single American had a full-time job today that's of 18 years or older, we'd still be 5 million people short in the labor force. And that's going to continue to grow. And so when you think about that, and then you say, okay, I definitely need to think about sourcing as many people as I possibly can and meeting those people where they're at, training those people, because this is the workforce of tomorrow. You also have to reconcile that with the Justice Department says that number is going to be 100 million people that have records by 2030. That's basically 6 years away. That's 36% of the American public is going to have some form of a record. Now, the average CEO may say, why does that matter? It matters because of the way that we're sourcing on the front end, especially with the advent of AI, where each piece of information on a resume or lack of information on a resume is reason to wholesale exclude folks. And that's why you have these talent wars that exist out there in society for top folks, right? And so what we've done at Checkr, it's interesting because, and this is why I respect Checkr so much and why I love where I work, is not only did we already have a hiring program for justice impacted people, but in a time when tech companies are cutting off thousands of people at the knees, right? They're having massive layoffs. Hundreds of thousands of people have been laid off in the last 18 months in tech. Ken, we want you to go out there and start an apprenticeship program and hire more people, right? It's not that we're not feeling the effects of the macroeconomy like anyone else. It's just that we've doubled down on our mission when it comes to diversity and inclusion, especially with justice impacted folks. We happen to subscribe to the philosophy that if you hire the most vulnerable population, the ones that have the hardest time getting the job, it makes the rest of the diverse populations easy. It's easy to get your head around LGBTQ or veterans or people with neurodiversity issues or people who have disabilities if you take the hardest group which is justice impact to people. Like, it's hard for us to get around the narrative that we have told ourselves about people who've went to prison, et cetera. And so, like, it's just really amazing that they've allowed me to build these apprenticeship programs for folks. And these aren't like minimum wage apprenticeship programs. These are people getting paid healthy, livable wages with full benefits. They get the benefit of the education. We're training them in the Checkr way. We're training them on the teams that they will be working for once they graduate. So it's just an amazing, amazing example of what's possible when you're intentional.
Absolutely. So let's do a hard-hitting question here, because we had talked about this before. When people hear fair justice hiring, they immediately think about the individual who murdered someone or stabbed someone or the worst possible scenario. But that isn't always who you're hiring, right? So give us some perspective, because you had shared a story about a woman who happened to be incarcerated. And if you looked at it for face value, nobody would have probably ever hired her.
Sure.
But there was a story behind it. Can you share that with us? Yeah,
sure. So one of the things I get a chance to do when I work with companies is I share a whole lot of background checks with folks, and I pressure test those background checks. And there's this one, and I have many, but I'll share one. There's this one background check in particular of a woman who did 16 years in prison for attempted murder. Now, if you saw this information on a piece of paper, here's a middle-aged Black woman. Attempted murder was her charge. She did 16 years in prison. By and large, 99.9% of the people I've ever talked to said that's an automatic no. Automatic, because I asked the question, how many people would hire? Everyone doesn't raise their hand. And so then I play a video and I share a story that, any of your audience members, if they want to see it, they can contact me. I'll share it with them, of this woman sharing her story and how she was the victim of domestic violence for several years and had her jaw broken. Her skull was fractured. Her arm was broken. Her child had been beaten up by her abuser. And finally, after years and years of this abuse, one day she psychologically snapped and shot him. And the reason she got the attempted murder charge, because it wasn't in the commission of an actual assault. It was just as a result of she had had enough and was done. And she thought that he was going to go on another one of his tirades. And so she did 16 years and she got out. And this woman, when she went to prison, was a registered nurse for like 20 years, had never been in trouble with the law. And when she got out, she couldn't get a job. She thought she was going to be able to go back into nursing. And because of occupational licensing restrictions, she wasn't able to do that. And she found herself flipping hamburgers at Wendy's for minimum wage. And it was very difficult for her to get back on her feet. And one day she was in line sharing her story with a friend, and there was a gentleman behind her who owned a blood lab and heard her story and said, there's no way in the world you should be working at Wendy's. I think I might have a position for you. And took her in, interviewed her, and gave her a job in the blood lab where she could take her nursing experience, right, where the licensing wasn't required. And she was able to actually go in and work in a medical environment, doing blood lab work. And she's went on to become very successful. But I ask executives when I showed her story and her testimony, now how many of you would hire her? Every single person raises their hand. And so I said, I know that you probably didn't realize this, but 10 minutes ago, I gave you a background check. That's the woman who no one said they would hire. And the moral to that story is that behind every piece of paper, behind every piece of information, there's a human story, right? And if you never take the time to ask the question, you never take the time to understand the person that you're talking to or the circumstances that led up to their situation, then you're passing on thousands and thousands and thousands of very valuable individuals, just this untapped talent source that we're missing because of our own bias. I share with people often, it's not the background check. Like, the background check is what it is. It's just a piece of objective information. It's us who are interpreting the background check and what that means. We all have a narrative of what that is or what it means, that we think we know what it means. And most of the time we're wrong is the challenge. And so I love being able to share stories like that, because it's storytelling and sharing individuals' paths that help change minds. I remember one of the stories I heard from a dear senator here in California when I was a policy director. And I went in there with all the statistics and the numbers, and I thought I had all the stuff down pat. And when I was done lobbying, she called me in her office and she said, Ken, she said, that was the most amazing statistical presentation I've ever heard. You know, every single criminal justice statistic out there and why I should pass the law. She said, but I want to share something with you. She said, all the statistics in the world are not what helped me change the mind of my constituents across the aisle. She said, it's storytelling. You have to be able to bring me the person who that bill affects in their district. It's the woman with the child who can't get childcare because of XYZ, right? It's the person who can't get across town to work because they don't have a token to get on the bus because of XYZ, right? You have to be able to come in and show those experiential stories. And so ever since then, I started to understand the story, the power of using human stories to convince people that we're all human, we've all made mistakes, and everyone should be given a chance to rebuild and reset their life and become a productive member of the community.
Absolutely. So we have a lot of HR pros that listen to this podcast, and I'm thinking about them as I'm listening to you. How do they get past the background check, and how do they get to the story?
Sure. That's a great question. So I work with a lot of folks in HR too. And the first thing I share with them is that they have to get executive sponsorship or buy-in, right? Most HR folks are not in a position to say, I'm going to hire someone that just got out of prison for homicide or some other kind of charge, assault with a deadly weapon, without risk of losing their job. And so really, when you are in the position of being an HR professional, the best thing you can do is educate yourself and then convince or attempt to convince or show why you should invest in fair chance hiring, which is primarily what I do, to an executive. And interestingly enough, some of the biggest and brightest executives in the country have invested in fair chance hiring. Jamie Dimon from JPMorgan Chase, who I just saw last week, 10% of their hires in the last 12 months were justice impacted people who had records. 4,300 people at the biggest financial institution in the country has invested in fair chance hiring. So whenever I hear companies say, oh, the risk, I say there's no bigger risk than the biggest banking system, biggest banking company in the Western Hemisphere is Chase.
Right.
And they've invested heavily. Not only have they invested on the company side, they've also invested heavily on unwinding policies. They're in Congress people's offices every day taking some of those legacy policies that have existed that says no felony, no misdemeanor, no arrest can work in this industry. They're actually lobbying every single day to unwind those policies and saying that if a person is not directly touching money, why wouldn't they be able to work at JPMorgan Chase? There's 1,000 jobs in marketing, HR, talent, recruiting, you name it, like sales. There's a whole bunch of jobs in most companies that have nothing to do with sometimes the core business. So they're leading the way. Stuart Butterfield is Slack. Many of us use Slack on a daily basis, invested heavily. PayPal, who many of us use online as a payment system, has invested. Zoom, the call that we're on today, they've invested in fair chance hiring. So there's dozens and dozens of companies who understand that when you give people an opportunity, you're going to get a great candidate in many cases. And so what I tell HR folks is, let's work on first step is let's get executive sponsorship, right? And work with our company or others. I point people in other directions to get educated so you know the talking points. And one of the things we do at Checkr is we teach workshops for free. Sometimes those workshops are like 1 day. Sometimes they're 3 months. I'm working with a company now I've been working with for 9 months. And we help those HR professionals get educated and create decks and presentations for their executive staff to use fair chance hiring as a spoke in their DE&I strategy, right? Most companies who are involved in a DE&I strategy also believe in belonging and justice and all those types of things. And so most of the time it's just they don't know about the 80 million people. They don't know about this population, right? And so most of the time they all want to fold it in, and we work with those HR professionals to teach them how to do it both at the executive level. And then the real work, once you get executive buy-in, is okay, well, how do you actually implement this? Because this can be hairy and scary. Right. And so the first thing is I tell people, when you invest in fair chance hiring, that doesn't mean hire every single person with a record.
Right.
We believe that every single company has a right to and should hire the best person for the job. We don't want them to lower the barrier, the bar, like I said. We just want them to lower the barrier to access, right? And so working with those folks, we say, okay, hey, first we want to make sure that you're getting the right talent in your pipeline.
Mm-hmm.
So working with community-based organizations in your area who do workforce development training for this population is the first step. You don't want to just take anybody in off the streets. You want someone who's went through soft skills. You want somebody who's went through digital literacy training. You want people who are prepared and can compete with everybody else. You don't want to have to like handhold people. You're looking for talent, right? And that's part of the job of the HR professional. And so we teach them how to do that, and we help bridge the gap with those relationships with community-based organizations. And sometimes it's not a community-based organization. It's a workforce development board who works with divisions of parole and probation to help get people trained and get them soft skills. And then we also teach a lot about onboarding. How do you onboard someone who has a record? Are there privacy issues that you should adhere to? Is your company one that wants to embed this in their culture, like JP Morgan Chase or Checkr? Or do you kind of want to just keep it quiet and kind of do it as a diversity initiative, but you don't want to announce it, that you're loud and proud, we call it, or that you are going to inject this into your company culture? So it's really up to each individual company. And then one of the things we teach the most that people have questions about is how do you adjudicate a background check, right? So you get a background check, you have a candidate that comes through, the candidate is stellar, they check all the boxes, you want them, you make a conditional offer of employment, now you have to run a background check. You run the background check. There's 3 charges. What do I do with this? How do I evaluate whether I should take the step with this candidate or not? So we teach that. The EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, has guidelines that they put out about 12 years ago to stop discrimination under Title VII for people who have records in this country. And the EEOC has this test called the nature test, where you're supposed to look at the nature of the charge versus the time that's passed since the charge happened and how that's related to a job. So for example, you may have somebody that committed an assault with a deadly weapon. They were 22 years old. The candidate is now 37. So it's very remote in time. They haven't had any charges since then. And is the assault with a deadly weapon applicable or related to the job of software engineer? Probably not. It'd be hard to make that argument that one is related to the other. So therefore, there's no reason that you shouldn't allow that person to become a software engineer because they had an assault at a bar fight or some other kind of circumstance at that time. So there are guidelines that guide all of us. It's not Checkr's guidelines. This actually comes from the federal government as anti-discrimination guidelines that they've set out. So that's kind of some of the conversations, a little bit of the conversations I have with HR professionals on a regular basis.
So should HR advocate for a policy related to disclosure or non-disclosure of a past criminal record? So let's say it's one of those organizations where they're saying, we're not going to go loud and proud yet. We're going to keep this under wraps, but we do want to support fair chance hiring. And they do hire someone with an arrest record. They come into the organization, all of a sudden, one of their employees, their team members, Googles them and finds it out. What's the risk to the organization? That's happened.
That's happened. I have a story that I love. I'm glad you asked that question. And just for your audience, we did not pre-plan this question. So I was working with a company here in Silicon Valley. It's a financial company. I won't say the name because they're not one of those loud and proud companies, but they're a very substantial tech company here. And they had been in the practice of hiring software engineers who had went through a justice impacted accelerator program, kind of a boot camp type program. And that happened. They did not announce it outside of HR. So the executives of the company knew, the HR people knew, and they had a policy of maintaining the privacy, which is standard practice. And the leader of that particular individual, the manager, decided to Google the person over time. Like the person had been there about a year and a half, and they just were curious about him, I guess, and Googled the person's name and found out that the person had done 20 years in prison. And so the manager goes back to HR, who then goes to the executives, and the manager's complaining, saying they didn't want the person on their team. And the executive at the company said, listen, we already vetted the person. They've been here. We have our own mechanisms in place. We understood that the person was justice impacted when we hired him, and we made a hiring decision to hire the person. So you need to leave that alone, and you probably shouldn't be Googling your team members anyway. And so the person didn't listen to that advice and continued to raise a little bit of fuss over it. And what I thought was one of the best examples of leadership I've ever seen is the CEO called that manager in and fired him and said that you don't meet with company culture. We've told you to leave this alone. You're constantly practicing discrimination and you're trying to stir up stuff over this person's background. And this person's just trying to live their life and they're a high performer in the company. And they ended up letting the manager go. And like when the COO told me that, I almost came to tears because I thought it was just an exemplary level of leadership to put your foot down on something you believe in and plant a flag. And that's for whoever it would be, whether it's for somebody who had a disability or whatever it is. It's just standing up to bullying, and that type of intimidation is something that we all should be doing on a regular basis in this society.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What a great story. Another great story. You have so many. So for our HR audience, when you think about hiring, Checkr you had alluded to the fact that you do have some training sessions. Where can they go to find out more about them?
Sure. So we do it for our customers. For those of your folks who may use Checkr as a background check company, we're the biggest background check company. So the chances are somebody who's listening probably uses Checkr. And we also do it externally. People can reach out to me. I run the social impact division at Checkr, and my team is the one responsible. We go across the country and teach these trainings to companies who request it. They can reach out to me at ken.oliver@Checkr, CHECKR.com. And I can connect them with our team members who set up appointments. We do an inventory and assessment. We go through a questionnaire with the company to find out their level of interest, what their needs are, what kind of positions they'd like to be able to fill in a pilot program. We also help companies establish apprenticeship programs. And what's interesting about the apprenticeship program is that the government at the state level and at the federal level will actually pay companies to invest in apprenticeship programs. So it's a way for companies to say, okay, this is like a 1-year internship program. The person will get educated. The government will subsidize the education, right, for registered apprenticeships. And then it's an earn and learn model where they'll work about 30 hours a week on their team. They'll go to school the other time. Then after a 1 year, the company can kind of assess where that person is at and decide to hire them or graduate them out into the ecosystem. But it's a win-win for the company because then they get a chance to invest in this D&I social impact effort, right, which is a feel good and also benefits the company and gets the company in the employee engagement up. But it's also great for the candidate because even if the company doesn't hire the apprentice at the end of a year, the person's walked away with a certification and education. They've walked away with on-the-job experience that they can take out there. And I can just share this with you. I remember talking to a woman who runs the criminal justice department at Stanford, and she ran a program, an entrepreneurship program for folks. And what was interesting to me is she talked about the change in perception of self when you're invested in by these institutions and organizations. And she said, Ken, when I would bring people to Stanford University and bring these CEOs in from Silicon Valley, guys would get admitted to the program and their shoulders would kind of be hunched. They wouldn't have that much dignity and self-respect for themselves. They were kind of like trying to find it. By the time they went through our program, they were walking with their shoulders back, their chest up, their head held high. They would bring their families on campus. And for the first time, they believed in themselves. Yeah. For the first time, somebody in society, whether it be a company, whether it be a CEO, whether it be a university, told them that they had a value. And so that has an amazing impact on society because that person will leave an apprenticeship program and go on believing that they can get a job in corporate America. They'll go on to another thing knowing that they have that degree or that certification in their pocket and that they earned that, right? It's an amazing ripple effect that every company should be investing in when it comes to underserved populations.
Absolutely. So HR pros, if you're not ready to jump all in, think about apprenticeship programs. And again, these individuals are sourced from local organizations who have already put them through a training program. So they're not walking right out from their incarceration right into the workforce. There's training that happens in between. And these individuals are prepared for your organization.
That's right.
Okay. All right. So unfortunately, we are coming to the end of our conversation. But before we let you go, we do something called rapid fire questions. So these are one sentence questions with one sentence answers. So our audience gets to know you a
This
little
is
bit
tough,
better.
Berta.
It is. Are you willing to play?
I'm ready.
All right, I'll go easy on you. What are bad recommendations you hear in your profession or area of expertise?
I hear bad advice when it comes to DE&I programs being a quota or being something that companies have to do versus something that they should do. Definitely bad advice.
When you get overwhelmed, how do you refocus?
Meditate. You know, in tech, I don't think I've worked under 70 hours since I've been at Checkr a week. So it's always important that at the end of the day and sometimes in the morning, I set time out to meditate and refocus myself.
If you could have your own billboard that would reach millions of people, what would your message be?
The power of possibility. That would be the message. I think every single human being has potential and a possibility. The question is how do we get everybody to fulfill it? I think there's power in that.
In the last 5 years, what new belief, behavior, or habit has most improved your life?
Wow. I don't want to sound cliche, but anything is possible. I mean, when you've experienced the trajectory I have over the last just 4 years now, since I walked out of prison in June 2019, I believe that anything's possible. And I also believe in providence.
What move, and I might know the answer to this, but I want to hear it directly from you. What move did you make that had the biggest positive impact on your career?
So that's a tough one. Monetarily, it would be getting written into the California budget for almost $30 million and creating a new model. But on a personal human impact story, bringing those 10 apprentices into Checkr and getting them on the front of the NASDAQ billboard in downtown New York, their pictures, and showing that they were just as valuable as Jamie Dimon or Elon Musk or anybody else. That was just, there's nothing in the world like seeing the happiness that those families felt and what those people felt by experiencing that.
Talk about standing tall.
That's right.
What's the biggest challenge you're facing today or that you think you'll face in the next 5 years?
Yeah. The biggest challenge is the undercurrent between profit and people. Mm-hmm. And I think businesses are stressed to reach shareholders and fulfill that aspect of the business. It makes it very challenging when it comes to corporate social responsibility and social impact, and to be able to plant your flag for people. And me, I'm a people person to the core. I believe in people over profits all day long. Although profits are important, but I believe in people first. That's probably the biggest challenge for me is reconciling those two things.
What's the main takeaway you want to leave our listeners with?
Yeah. The main thing that I want listeners to understand is that every single person has a value and that we shouldn't prejudge folks. And when people make mistakes, which every single person that's listening to this has made a mistake that they haven't told anybody. And no one should be judged for the worst decision or the worst mistake that they've ever had in perpetuity, right? That doesn't mean there shouldn't be consequences. There should. But people grow out of these things. People age out of these things. And every single person should be given an opportunity to reset and make a difference. I just think it's so ironic that in businesses, in sports, in tech, we teach fail to get to success. But when it comes to human beings, we don't extend that same grace. And so I encourage every human being to embrace failure, because that's how we're going to get to the winning recipe, is by failing and learning. It's the human condition.
It is. And you told us before how to get a hold of you, but one more time, where can people go to learn more about you?
Sure. Checkr.org, or the easiest way to get a hold of me is ken.oliver@checkr.com. You can also find me on LinkedIn, where a lot of people read a lot of my stuff and learn about fair chance hiring. So I'm more than willing to talk to any single person that has a question, or if they're ready to get started on their fair chance journey or how to introduce it into their company. More than happy to do that along the way and support.
Today, we have been joined by the incredible Ken Oliver, Vice President of Checkr.org. Thank you again for joining me, Ken. It has been such an incredible pleasure and honor.
Thank you, Bert. I appreciate you. Thank you.
I really hope you enjoyed this episode. Thanks so much for watching. We would love it if you shared your thoughts on any of the topics we discussed in the comments below. And if you got value from the video, it would mean the world to us if you hit the like button and subscribe to the HR Morning channel. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Voices of HR.